If any of you have any last-minute questions you'd like to, please raise them and someone will pick them up, hopefully. My first question is to Ms. Harbaugh. You talk a lot about Facebook's efforts to, combat fake news and things like that, but it does raise interesting definitional questions.
Yeah.
And my questions are essentially twofold. How do you define fake news? And how do you undertake these policies that you're doing without crowding out heterodox opinion? In other words, will your system merely reinforce conventional wisdom in the political spectrum?
Yeah. No, I think that's something that we look at a lot and we really struggle with, and it's why we don't just take content down. Everybody has a different definition sometimes of what's true or not, particularly when you start to get into political speech. And so that's why we don't want to be the arbiters of truth. You've probably heard us say that quite a bit. It's why we work with the fact checkers, and we work with a wide variety of fact checkers. It's not just one. And so people, if they're seeing that content, they can at least see an alternative viewpoint of somebody that may have debunked certain stories. We did that a lot, actually, in Alabama. We saw a lot of the fact checkers were writing stories about whether or not one of Roy Moore's accusers whether he had actually signed that yearbook. And so we the fact checkers marked about 200 stories, that URLs on Facebook that were talking about that as false, and so that way their unit was underneath it. But this is a conversation that we keep having of trying to think through what are the best ways of combating this, and also what are the best ways of providing people alternative other viewpoints. Because we initially had started by having a big red flag that this was disputed, trying to really put it in their face. Turns out that made people believe it even more, made them want to even share it even more, and you have to be a bit more subtle about it. And so that's why this is always sort of something that we have to constantly be looking at and iterating on.
Can I say one thing to that?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's what Katie just said is so important for people to understand, is because people want these organizations to know the right answer, and then they try a bunch of things, and if they don't get it exactly perfect, then everyone second guesses it. And I think that's the thing that we're learning. I mean, the learning that putting a big red flag is actually an indicator for people to consume more is completely counterintuitive. But for anyone to have said that they knew that, I mean, obviously it would happen, but then it's seen as a failure. And this is the problem, is that we have to be kind of responsible enough to realize that we are going to have to work through understanding this, because it's new not only to the consumer, but also to the person pushing the information out. And I think that that's what's sometimes lost, is because everyone wants the answer yesterday. They want to deploy very quickly, and the unintended consequences of it are pretty significant. And so we think about this a lot, and I just flagged that because I do think it was such an important learning, because I actually think the concept of Facebook of fail faster is so important, but you can't only enjoy failing faster when it doesn't impact you or something you care about. And this is the challenge with politics, because now it's become so personalized. And people have really lost that because, as I said, people have lost their minds. It's almost like they're incapable of looking at it constructively, and we're seeing this more and more. And I think Facebook has now become almost like the hub through which all these arguments that people are having is occurring under. And so I just think that that's such a key point.
Yeah. I myself am very disappointed with Facebook. I will occasionally post links to papers I've written and get 2 or 3 likes, but I post a picture of my dog with a hat on his head, and it goes mad. By the way, he is an astonishingly cute
I think
dog.
the learning from that is you need to post a picture of your dog with the paper and help get more reach.
I am considering interviewing him for the Institute podcast. All right, now, this is for Juliet, and other people too might have a better sense of the data here. When we look at the various apps here, is there a possibility that millennials will move away? Particularly, I'm thinking of Facebook. I mean, because I've seen young people say, "Oh, Facebook is just so boomers can complain about young people." The other best definition I've heard of Facebook is the place where you discover why you really dislike somebody back in high school.
That's not false. Yeah.
No, but there's there, and I mean, is there any data on trends? Are we reaching saturation? Will we see a decline?
Sure. So obviously, my fellow panelists can speak more to the exact numbers, but from personal experience living in the millennial culture, the idea of Facebook is that it's kind of reached its saturation point. That is a very common idea and belief among my generation and people my age, especially here in college. Yet Facebook still plays a very vital role in the distribution of information. If we want to know like what events are going on, if we want to know news articles, if we want to know what our friends and family are saying on this issue, we either go to Facebook or Twitter. Now, just in regard to common usage, that's definitely Snapchat. I mean, Snapchat is just going through the roof. I'm guilty of that too. But we still do rely on Facebook in a way that we don't rely on others yet. I'd say Twitter is probably the closest rival in regard to the distribution of information and the expression of personal beliefs. But regarding usage and saturation point, I would say that Facebook has kind of reached a limit personally.
But is there any data on that?
I think we have over 200 million users in the United States. I mean, there's 2 billion users all over the globe, and so we still see people are definitely using it, but they are using these different platforms in different ways. And I don't think this has to necessarily be a zero-sum game. We also have, Instagram's also part of the Facebook family. You have WhatsApp, and people are using these apps in different ways, in really interesting ways in which to communicate, and particularly to your point as well about it being so much more visual. And those things like Snapchat and Instagram really help to fit to that. And there's changes we're making to Facebook too around trying to make that a lot more visual, a lot more about video.
I think it's also important that people realize that it's impossible for an app to be all things to all people, so people use the apps differently. So I mean, the fact that Facebook is also Instagram, Messenger, WhatsApp, I mean, it has a kind of a holistic reach. But Trump used Twitter. If you ask the Trump Trump would think, I don't even think he thinks of Twitter as like digital. I think it's just a communications tool, and that's how he leverages it. But if you ask this campaign why he won the election, it would be Facebook. And it's because on Facebook there's more community, that you get donations, you get activists, you get volunteers, you get information out. And so everyone has a different role to play, just like we do in our everyday lives. Everything online is just like offline, but it tends to be force multiplied because we've removed the friction to participate in it. And so Facebook's real power is the size of its community and the engagements and the things that you can do. And I think that's exactly right. Like, it may not be Snapchat generationally is to what a lot of us who use text messaging is like. A Snapchat is a version of that. It just doesn't stay around. And that was very hard for me to kind of wrap my head around, is like, how should I use Snapchat? But I see all my staff in the office who are young using it as a text message replacement. And they don't mind that things are in and then they pop out and they disappear. Whereas like, I want every photo of my kid ever humanly possibly taken and talk about it all the time. And I save my snaps just to do that. So like, I completely don't use it the right way, but I think it's really important to understand that these all play different roles, and a smart campaign or any corporation or anything has to understand what role they play, because they're not just one output.
Now, this question for Mark and Zach, but please, everyone feel free. You were talking about the effectiveness you're talking about the effectiveness of Trump's Twitter, right? But this is surely not purely a technological function. It's a particular interface between a technology and a unique individual. Can anybody else but Donald Trump drive Twitter in the same way?
I think that's a very good question, particularly in terms of the media coverage. I mean, one of the geniuses of Donald Trump was his ability to say something and essentially decide what was going to be covered in the media over the next news cycle in a way that none of the other candidates could. So certainly none of the other candidates could master Twitter in the same way that President Trump could. Although, I think he was also willing to take the risk of doing things, and so I think as Zach was mentioning, to be less structured, to not have it go through all these different filters before it happened, and that immediacy made it very successful. Can it be replicated? That's a good question. I suspect it can at some extent, but in many ways, he is a sui generis candidate.
Yeah, I mean, it can be replicated by anyone if you can figure out how to talk like Donald Trump, or the equivalency on. I mean, it can be done. It's just a question of, can you personally do it? And I think risk reward is a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, he also takes the bad with the good. I mean, he puts things out there. A lot of candidates, when they go out there, you saw a couple try to go toe to toe with him. Marco for about 5 days try to be Donald Trump, and then pulled back because he said he was ashamed. I don't think that Donald Trump feels like that. I mean, the reason that we follow Donald Trump, Trump on Twitter is that I find out my news at the exact same time Amy does, and Amy is actually a world-class reporter, and I am a person on Twitter. Like, I get information. He is truly bypassing, and so you hear it. I mean, it's also why people, I think, are reading Axios in real time, because they're kind of like, it's almost like you get to be a little fly on the wall in the West Wing because everything's being leaked in real time. Like, there's an element of all of us wanting to see this and pulling it in. Whether that's good or bad, that's a whole other conversation. But why people are doing it, you follow Donald Trump on Twitter because you are finding out just as soon as everyone else. Yeah. The difference is then it drives so much earned media because it tends to be so unique that then people report on it because it is news by definition. Now that he's president, it truly is news. So people lament it and they talk about it, but to understand how he uses it and the fact that it's in his voice and people argue over whether it's an Android phone or an iPhone and is it really him, and he does it from 6 a.m. I mean, I think people get up at 6 a.m. to see what he tweets by 8 a.m. and then slows down. He has conditioned us. Attention is a muscle. He has literally trained us to be how he wants us to consume. And for people to not understand that, they'll miss the larger point of kind of like how he's leveraging his technology.
Any thoughts, Katie, Julia?
So one thing that I think Donald Trump has really mastered is that social media, he understands, is meant to be enraging and engaging. You know, the very mediocre posts that politicians are used to putting out on Facebook and Twitter just don't do it anymore. And as Dr. Jones mentioned, you know, it's those words that everyone then searches. You know, you have to be, you know, the colloquial American and the colloquial millennial. I mean, he tweets like a millennial. He tweets more than I do, you know? And so he's conquered that idea that even though, you know, take the bad with the good, it's oftentimes the bad that gets you more response and more awareness than even the good.
The only thing I would just point out, too, that I find interesting as well is how he's using all these different mediums of communication to be getting these messages out. I think too much we try to silo this of like, was it social media, was it TV, was it, you know, all these different things, and it really was the combination of them and how they all work together that I think will be really interesting to be looking at how that played out in 2016 and how it's going to play out in 2018 and 2020.
I think it's really important also to understand the frame. A lot of people, especially in the news media, thought it was really interesting when Obama said he was going to do this after 12, and they created like the White House changed the way they do video. Like, it's the lens through which you see it is also really important, because a lot of what Trump did is just doing what Obama did, but more personally and on steroids. And so it was a different, like, even like the way we're talking about reporting and Facebook advertising. We were lauded by the Obama technology and data team in 2012 for doing all the things now that is now threatening democracy and going to take the world apart. There was a time when this was, and again, the world changes, we have better understanding, our comprehension, but there is also a lens through which is seen, which I think powers a lot of his stuff, because it goes back to my point that, you know, 46% of people think the news is made up as they go. They get frustrated by it. And so it's just important that when you see it, there used to be a time that these stories were seen through a totally different lens of how great it was to bypass the media through social. Yeah,
and a question, I mean, it could be all of you. The question that could be for all of you. You know, I remember, is Mr. Rove in the audience? Yes. You know, I remember a time when, you know, message discipline was this, you know, every time I'd open an article about a campaign, it was like message discipline, the lack thereof, or its presence. But given the remarkable success of President Trump in 2016, how important is this message discipline? Because as you mentioned, it's over in 14 hours, 16 hours, we move on to another subject. How important is message discipline?
I think he sort of did have it with like slogans like "Make America Great Again" and things like that were a constant through everything that he was saying.
Yeah, I agree. The umbrella message is consistent. Right. I mean, I think his execution at times was a little bit different, and people thought it wouldn't translate to the general. But there is actually a lot of truth to that he was able to do that. He takes himself off message, which is, you know, sometimes by choice and sometimes in general. But it is interesting that they drive towards a common point and actually hold up people accountable towards a message. I mean, I still have trouble figuring out what the Hillary Clinton's message was, other than saying not Donald Trump, which we found gets you about 48% of the vote. Like, that's just not enough. And I think that's like what they're learning is that, like, I think he articulated a case. If you ask people in the Midwest, I mean, border security, jobs are being relocated, America first. I mean, there was a message to it. And I think that, you know, if you fail to see that, you miss the larger point of why he was successful, because they go back and they say, this is what he's for. You know, maybe he'll break things, but I know that the career politicians will break it because they've broken it. And I think that there's a truth to that, and it's hard to kind of see, but there is a success from that.
Well, and I think he also had a bit of Teflon compared to many other candidates, in that he was excused of errors that for other candidates candidates the media would have latched onto and never let go if it had been Rick Perry or Ted Cruz. But just because of who he was and his ability to not be bothered by it, whereas maybe another candidate might have felt distracted by it, a need to apologize, a need to sort of revisit it, he just bore on through. And so that ability, I think, also allowed him to get off message, but then not get sidetracked by it, whereas another campaign might have spent the next 2 weeks apologizing for something that they had, offended.
As someone who had a team that misspelled an error in an app for Governor Romney, I can tell you when you're brittle, it's really tough. When you make one mistake, that's all you talk about for 2 weeks. The Trump campaign was lucky if they only had one typo a day. And they never bothered about it. But it completely changed your culture. If you can do that, it changes how you respond. And Hillary Clinton was much more like the Romney campaign than the Trump campaign. And there's a certain element. And they also had a candidate who could never go direct to camera and pull it off. Every time she did, especially you see her on Snapchat, it was cringeworthy. There was this thing called chilling in Iowa. It was like uncomfortable. If you were young and you watched it, that became the meme. So there's an entire generation who's like, how is this humanly possible that someone chose to hit publish? And that's part of the role of a campaign, is to protect the candidate. You can't put them in situations where they can't thrive, because it's a dangerous thing. And Trump has picked his mediums, but that is one of the challenges too, that his team puts him in places where he can be successful. They don't put him in places long-form debate, long-form conversation. That's not where he thrives, and so they just look for different things. And there's a strategy to how they execute these things.
Any thoughts on anything else? Mark? Okay. Unsurprisingly, Katie, 2/3 of my questions.
Should probably use a mic.
Mike, I like to get far away from the mic so everyone has to lean forward to hear what I have to say. This makes me the anti-Trump. 2/3 of the questions are about Facebook.
Not surprisingly.
Not surprisingly. You went through a lot of these measures that Facebook is currently undertaking or has in the past undertaken to improve the quality of the product that people see. There's a lot of talk now about regulating.
Yeah.
Facebook in particular. I assume that you don't think government regulation of Facebook is a good idea, or perhaps I'm wrong, but do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Well, I'd actually, if you watched Mark's interview last week with CNN, he actually said that he's open to regulation, and I think that that's something that we're working with different governments on, of what that might look like. I mean, there's the immediate term ones of ads transparency and the regulation of just political ads in general, because at least here in the U.S., the FEC does not require a disclaimer on online ads. Most campaigns put it on there, but they're doing a hearing on June 27th to be looking at that. For instance, it would be really helpful to have somebody helping us to think through, how do you actually define an issue ad? Because I think that's something that it shouldn't be just Facebook coming up with their definition, Google coming up with their definition, Twitter coming up with their definition. We should have a single definition for all of us to be looking at. And so those are active conversations that we're having with governments all over the globe.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important too, though, that this is an existential threat theoretically to democracy if you think foreign governments are getting involved. It is not Facebook's the only organization responsible for solving this. There's a national security element to this. There's if you want to give Facebook the ability to subpoena and to pull, it's just amazing to me how we've kind of abdicated all responsibility as if it's a platform's responsibility to go solve these problems, especially when we've known that these were happening in other countries since 2014. I get frustrated because I think it's like an overcorrection, and I get why from a communications perspective, but there's going to be a much more active role of government beyond regulating companies if we are going to, across all platforms and across all technology, push back on this, because there needs to be some standardization, and I think that's lacking right now while we're kind of in the hysterical moment of figuring out this element. I don't know that we would be like this if a different election result had come out, or the role of the Russians. So it's just something I flagged that, because I do think that's also very easy to put on Facebook, but I think that's one of the challenges we have to deal with.
Any other thoughts on this? Any other thoughts? on regulation?
Well, I would also just point out, I think that sometimes it's a little overblown, this idea of Russian interference, that there was maybe Russian involvement, but we involve ourselves in elections throughout the globe as well in different ways. And it's just part of, it's the natural take of foreign policy. And whether it was consequential or not, I think is questionable.
That's one of the fascinating questions, like that a lot of this is bringing up, that I think all of us, it's not just us at Facebook, like broader, I talk to a lot of, whether it's think tanks, academics, different universities, we've been doing a lot of these sorts of discussions, because thinking about, when you think about just foreign interference, not all foreign activity in another election is necessarily considered bad. You have the BBC that will cover the US election. Would you say, you had people in the UK talking about our election, we were talking about Brexit. That seems okay, but then you replace one of those countries with Macedonia or Russia or China, and everybody freaks out. And so where do you draw those lines? How do you think about that? How do you think about domestic actors and doing some of the similar things, and also that sort of discourse? And what does that mean for free speech? It's just, this is why I really love my job, because these are just questions that we haven't found the answers to yet, and we're sort of setting the course for how communication and political discourse is going to be happening for decades.
No, I mean, that's a good point. Last year at the Baker Institute, we had a group of a Cuban delegation here, and one of the things they were complaining about was U.S. interference in Cuban public affairs through essentially Radio Marti, TV Marti, the distribution of computers and other technology, effectively trying to undermine their government from our perspective.
Look, we're coming rapidly to a close here. Zach, you were basically talking at least a bit about, generals fighting the last war, right? In other words, the difficulty, and this is not new. This has happened as new technologies emerge. Television, I'm sure, yielded a gigantic revolution in advertising. I can remember when direct mail that's how old I am, Viggory and direct mail was this gigantic breakthrough. But what is the next big thing? Look forward. What is let's talk about it, and I'm sure you're going to hedge, but what is the next big thing? I know you're going to say, well, we won't know until it happens. But have you any thoughts on the next? And this is for everybody.
Well, if I knew what the next big thing, I'd be a venture capitalist and I wouldn't be here. But no, I think that the reality is that it's getting more personalized, it's more local, and it's more mobile. I mean, that's the reality. Like, the consumption is moving to your device. Your device is powering everything, so it will be built around that. The challenge will be, it's hard to actually see what's coming next, because I don't know. It used to be kind of the Wild West where everything goes, and now as regulation starts to move in and what we like and how we think about our own privacy and what does that look like, I think that will change. I think Americans have a different perspective on privacy than Europeans, and what does it look like to be a global company. But I think that the reality is that it will be how people try to communicate with how people actually consume information. Right. And I think that is the death of the 30-second TV spot. That is not how anyone would naturally consume information. We trained ourselves to consume it that way, but as that breaks down, I mean, you have ESPN, who's kind of the bedrock of live sports, now moving to literally selling you, through mobile subscriptions to not have to watch it on television. I mean, that's when Disney is breaking from that tradition, kind of the market has spoken. And so I think that what we see is we see all these truths that are occurring, the speed at which that accelerates. And then also when that all starts to fragment, how do you then do it when you're competing for attention when everyone wants attention? And the question is we're in the era of unbundling, but will the future actually bundle everything back up and pull things back together? And again, what's old is new. It's just through a different format. And I think that's what we're trying to grapple with is where do we get our news? How do we get it? It's funny, the piece what you mentioned about and self-selecting in your news feeds, but actually studies have shown that people's news feeds are still more unbiased than their national consumption of the publications that they read. It shows you who you are, but there's also a reality that they've found that social media actually does bring more into your feed than how you live. It's just that you don't have this one concrete thing that you look at, because really Facebook is kind of like the homepage of the internet. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes like its own internet. And so it's just important to think that, but we think about how we live, there's a lot of the publications we read offline, it's the same bias. It's just we don't feel quite as strongly about it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts down the line on this?
You know, when I think about what's coming next, to me, it's actually kind of frightening, because you talk about the 6 second, and we have a 6 second attention span as millennials. And I don't know if y'all watched the Olympics, but there was that 5 second Toyota spot that kept popping up after every single race, and it completely disoriented my mother. But that's the only ad I remember. And what type of information do you get through in 5 seconds? That's dangerous. But it's also, what information do you get through on a headline? Because a lot of issues that everyone, especially if you're in the public light, everyone is facing, is that people get information from the headline. They don't always click on the article to read the article. So if the headline is misleading, that's an issue. And if the headline doesn't tell you the whole story, that's also an issue. And so the future for me is like this incredible distillation of information to the bare bones, which can be very deceptive.
Can I get a more optimistic view of it, though? Yes, it's 5 seconds, but I think if you got Mr. Rove or someone else, like, you can give your message in 5 seconds. It doesn't have to be. Like, it's easy to assume the worst of it, but if we just reality of like how people consume, like, I also think that's what's true still, right? People want message. They want to be able, you just have less time to fight for it. You don't get the luxury of 30 seconds and to build a narrative to get there. So you have to start right off the bat. And I actually think the best operatives and the best campaigns will solve for this by acknowledging the way the world really works, not the way they want it to work, and then reacting accordingly. And so, like, I actually am more optimistic. We've had a 6 second attention span, like when you go back, maybe it was 8 before. Like it's not like it hasn't changed huge amounts. We just didn't know it because we weren't being trained that way. Millennials are just on the forefront because they don't watch the TV spots the same way. Their muscle memory is just being trained differently. I don't think we as humans are that different.
Two really quick things. I think one, it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, you saw this with Parkland, but as young people such as yourself and others are starting to graduate from school and starting to be involved in politics, their involvement in politics looks very different than just going out and voting. And I think that's something that people are kind of slow to coming around to, of how people want to be engaged. On the other side, too, of things that, like, particularly we're looking at as well, is when you think about things like false news, you're starting to also get into a thing where, like, audio and video can start to be changed and make it look like somebody said something even though they didn't. And so how do we try to get ahead of that and be thinking about that? Because that's going to be even harder to combat than people just sharing URLs.
Mark, any brief thoughts on the big issue?
I think I'll start with that one.
Well, then I would like one last thing.
One thing for everyone to think about, though, because we're talking about these micro things, there are micro trends within these macro things that are going on. Mark Penn actually has a very interesting book that's just come out, Microtrends Squared, that talks about the very fact that people now used to get married right out of high school, and now they're getting married in their 30s. What that's done is it's pushed people's lives back 10 years, and we still don't know what that means. And it has impacts on how often you go to church, because you go to religion once you have a child, so now people are going 10 years later. It has an impact of how you consume your information. Like, the life cycle is being pushed back, so while younger people are going to also get involved more, history is a pretty good indicator that also they become more Republican, conservative over time. Like, there's macro trends going on with how people are living their lives that actually are far more impactful than what we're doing just with the social. So when you look at it as right now, it's because you see it as a snapshot, but if you play it out 10 years, the whole shift of how people are choosing to live their lives in cities, getting married later, has, I think, a much more impactful thing on this than anything else.
Well, look, I would like to thank all of my panelists for what I think was a wonderful session.
Thank you.
And I believe we have a coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you again.